Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Oh gosh, was that louder than I meant? Everybody jumped guiltily. For those of you that don't know me, my name's Natasha McEnroe and I'm the General Secretary here at the Society of Antiquaries. I would like to bid you all a very warm welcome. It's such a lovely sunny day outside that I'm impressed to see so many of you here. I would also like to welcome our online audience. I know that there's quite a lot of people watching online, so welcome to you as well. The people who are in the hall here, just two housekeeping notes. One is if you wouldn't mind checking if your mobile phones are on silent. You don't want to be that person. And the second thing is that we don't have a fire drill scheduled for this lunchtime. If by any chance the alarm goes off, please follow myself or any members of staff who are wearing a pink lanyard, and we'll meet outside in the courtyard in front of the statue of Joshua Reynolds, appropriately enough. So here at the Society, we welcome creative responses to our historic collections and different ways of looking at historic work. And I think that today's talk very much falls into that category, something that's visually stunning, but also a little bit of an unusual way for us all to be looking at how we look at the past. It's with great pleasure that I introduce Dr. Ella Hawkins. Ella is a Shakespeare scholar, a design historian, and an artist, as you can see by her work on the screen. And she shares her fascination with design by creating edible art that is inspired by historic textiles. Textiles, objects, houses, stories from the past, all of these feed into Ella's artwork. She works with a number of cultural institutions, including the British Library, Jane Austen's house, Milton's cottage, and she's a senior lecturer at the Royal Welsh College of Music and Drama and author of Shakespeare in Elizabethan Costume, Period Dress in 21st Century Performance. Ella has very kindly said that she will take questions after her talk, so somebody will be dashing around with a microphone. But in the meantime, you can all sit back. I hope you've had your lunch, because once you see Ella's lovely images, you're going to be especially peckish. So without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to Ella.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming, and thank you so much for having me. I feel very privileged to be here at the Society of Antiquaries. If you're online, I can promise you this is a stunningly beautiful building that we're in, full of architectural details that would all make beautiful biscuit sets. So who knows? Carved stonework and fireplaces and all sorts. So I'm going to be talking with you today. I'm going to take you on a journey through many of the biscuit sets that I have made over the past few years. I'm very fortunate in that this has all happened a little bit by accident. As Natasha said, I'm a Shakespeare scholar first and foremost. And by accident, I started doing this, and it's become something that's brought me a lot of joy over the years. So I'll talk through my process, past biscuit sets, and I will be very happy to answer your questions. So in terms of where it all began, back in about 2019, I was at the tail end of my PhD research. It was a very difficult time. It was very difficult. And I was writing about this production of Twelfth Night that was staged at Shakespeare's Globe Theatre in London back in 2012. And I realized, first of all, that I loved these costumes very, very dearly. I was writing about costume design, and particularly about how Elizabethan clothing had been reproduced for modern audiences, why this period of history is so visually appealing to us now, which bits we take, which bits we leave behind, and how designers are so creative with their color schemes, choosing different garments that work together. And I was very lucky to be able to interview the designer of this production, Jenny Tiramani. And I thought I wanted I don't know, first of all, really look in detail at these costumes, but also take something with me that would show how much I love them. And so I decided to recreate the costumes in biscuit form. And this is what that set looked like. This was a very early attempt at capturing historical textiles in royal icing, which is my primary medium. And what it was that I enjoyed about it, I think, is that it gave me a chance to really look at those textures and those details and pull out what it was that made that production so specific. You know, it had a very clear aesthetic. So for example, this is very special. It's called cut and uncut silk velvet, which had been reproduced in Italy specifically for this production. And the pattern's made up of these tiny loops, which have been cut open to create that almost fluffy surface. And only when you really zoom in on the pictures can you get a sense of the fabulousness of that design. It's reproduced from a historic textile, but it's a brand new piece of art, really. And also Mark Rylance, this is Olivia, Mark Rylance playing Olivia, his lace ruff here as well. This was an original piece of Elizabethan lace that the production team had used and set into that ruff shape. So that became a biscuit as well. And these were even more difficult to appreciate the detail of. These are the costumes for the twins, Viola and Sebastian. And if you look really closely, these fabulous silk golds, doublets and hose have this pinked pattern in them that had been put in by hand, these tiny holes that had been carved through it, as well as these handmade buttons with silk threads wrapped around wood, and these details on the gauntlets there. So something about being able to look at them, I really enjoyed. And it also meant that I could pull out things that you might not even have seen if you'd been to see this production, or even if you saw a recording of it now, because it's a tiny detail that's almost there for the company as opposed to for the audience. This is a tiny miniature of Mark Rylance as Olivia that was painted because there's a line in Act 3, Scene 4 that Olivia says, "Here, wear this jewel for me, 'tis my picture." And so they commissioned a tiny portrait so that there would be a picture, a jewel that Olivia could give to Viola. And so if you haven't seen that, it's there in the biscuit set. So you can see it in a different. So this was a very early biscuit set, but that's what I liked about it. It felt to me like I was doing that close reading work that I would do in my academic studies, but making it almost like a collage from scratch. And then also someone could eat it when it was done, which felt like a bonus. These were vanilla flavored. I will tell you when the flavor varies because flavor is something I'm quite interested in too. So that was 2019. And then I finished my PhD in 2020. You'll remember that was quite a tumultuous time. And it was the midst of the pandemic. I was stuck at home and I thought I could do more with this idea of really, I loved the time that I spent crafting these objects. And I looked around my office and I had this calendar, which was out of date at that point. This is the recent one, but it was the version that I had at the time. It was from the Victoria and Albert Museum and it was arts and crafts textiles. So William Morris, also John Henry Durrell. And I thought, these patterns, I love them, but they're also super interesting. Like they're so complex. There's different components going on in them. I want to spend some time with them. If you look at this, for example, this is Cray, a little extract that's at the V&A. There's on the one hand these pinks and reds and greens, but there's also in the background this white pattern on black. And royal icing is perfect for capturing this kind of layering of pattern. And I saw an opportunity to really spend some time trying to recreate that. So in a very high-tech fashion, I got my calendar and I cut a rectangle out of an A4 piece of paper and layered it onto the different patterns to see if I could find which rectangles really captured the essence of each pattern. You know, how could I get that color scheme and those particular shapes that would somehow capture something of the whole? So I gathered those, played around with the design, and ended up with a biscuit set that looked like that. And that's when I really started to find my style, I guess, if I were to say it like that. The possibility of creating a whole set that looked like, 8 objects, for example, or more or less, that somehow worked together as a set, but ultimately that captured something about either the period style I was focusing on, the particular objects, the particular stylistic features. So that felt very exciting to me. And in terms of how I actually do this, what the process looks like to get from just a bare biscuit, or you might know it as a cookie, if you're particularly in America. This is the early stages. So royal icing is a wet substance that can be piped, it can be manipulated, and you can use a wet-on-wet technique to add color to that base layer. So that's why it worked so well for the V&A William Morris patterns, because there was that first layer you could achieve using that technique. And then once that dries, you can then layer that on top of it. You can use different colors, you can pipe different colors into the center and really manipulate the icing using different tools. So that's why royal icing seemed perfect for William Morris. It's not something I'd thought about before, but somehow those things came together and I realized that I could do lots and lots and lots of different things. So I'm going to take you through some of the different areas that I've focused on. I found that whenever I've made a biscuit set that is one thing, such as arts and crafts style, I have to do something completely radically different next. So if it's something modern, I have to go more historical. If it's pattern, I have to then focus on texture or something like that. So we're going to go next to archaeology, which is all these different historic objects that I've tried to reproduce as accurately as I can. And this also, I think, was a product of the pandemic, because I don't know about you, but when I was stuck at home, I missed going to museums. I missed seeing these special objects and being able to look at them, or even to hold things if they weren't necessarily as precious. And this meant that I could actually feel that I'd met these objects that I was looking at. And I do feel now like they're my friends a little bit. If I see them out in the wild, things that I've spent time recreating, I feel like I know them very intimately from having spent that time with them. So first of all, this set was inspired by the Staffordshire hoard. So we're talking 570 to 630 AD here. These are very local to where I live in Birmingham in the UK. They're cared for by Birmingham Museum and Art Gallery and the Potteries Museum and Art Gallery in Stoke. And I just adore the style of these objects. They are metal that's been hammered into thin sheets as a base. They're decorated with filigree, which is gold that's been rolled into thin wires to form these cells, or to form this filigree effect that's then soldered to the base. And garnets are cut into shape and added to those cells. And the object you're looking at here is described very in detail as a large mount in the records. Basically, these are very mysterious objects. The collection that they come from, a lot of it's weaponry, it's a lot of sword hilts, helmet pieces, that kind of thing. These are thought to have been decorative details that were hammered onto Bibles or other precious objects and then removed from them. So you still have tiny holes that were used to hammer those decorative features on. So we don't know exactly what they came from, but that's what we know about them, a large mount. I wish I knew more about specifically the object it was from. This is a serpent style pattern in the middle there. And here's another one. I decided in this case to almost make perfect versions of these ruined objects. So whereas the ones that you can see in the photographs have garnets missing, they've been twisted, they've been in the ground for many, many years, I decided to see if I could make them perfect again, which is not always the case, but I love the color scheme of them. Similarly to the other one, this is using royal icing. I'm piping that rolled gold effect, so I'm having a different version of that, and using gold paint to make it really shine. I absolutely love it when biscuits or cookies have gold details on. The originals have a foil behind the garnets to make the color pop and to give them some texture. I used a bit of edible food coloring to achieve the same effect. And this mysterious liquid, which is a combination of syrup, food coloring, which then stays moist. So it doesn't feel like a garnet in this case, but it achieves the effect, which was fun to experiment with. We go from that era to ancient Greek pottery sherds. These were particularly interesting as a process for me because I decided to try making three-dimensional biscuits. So rather than having those very neat rectangles that you saw in the previous sets, These, I couldn't buy a cookie cutter to cut them out. I had to cut them out of paper, use that as a template, cut around them with a knife, and then bake them individually on a semi-sphere cake tin. So that each one, it took a very, very long time. But these were orange cardamom and vanilla flavored, which is my favorite flavor. But the really special thing about this set, I think, is that for the first time, I tried making them look as old and as damaged as I possibly could to make them really look like the real thing. So to show you side by side, that meant adding scratches, adding chip marks. It's all an optical illusion. I didn't chip away at the icing. It's done through food coloring and texture and detail like that. But it was quite a scary moment when I'd spent hours painting, not hours, I took maybe 1 hour to paint the design onto that biscuit. And I sat kind of with it in my hand, holding what's called a scribe tool, which is a needle on a stick, thinking like, should I just do it? Should I just see what happens if I scrape away the surface? Decided to, and was very happy that I did. And it's something that I've played with a lot since. Because even this, this is a kind of technique that's used to create the original on the left, where the surface is actually scraped away. Sometimes it's referred to as sgraffito, but in this case, it has a different name. But it's carved away to leave the design behind. So I tried to do something similar with my royal icing as well. And you can even make them look like they've got deep cracks running all the way through. That was another moment where I was sat like, do I destroy it or will this add to the effect? And it turns out crack marks are achievable with that scribe tool that you then darken with a little bit of food coloring afterwards. Any mudlarkers in the room? I have always wanted to go mudlarking. I envy anybody who's had the opportunity to do it. The thought of walking along the Thames in London or other bodies of water, looking for whatever artifacts are left behind and collecting them and gathering them. I follow quite a lot of mudlarkers on Instagram, and I kept seeing photographs of these finds that had come from the River Thames. And I thought, well, I could hold them in my hand if I make them in biscuit form. I could have my own mudlarking collection. And the flavor here very much played into that. This was sea salt and brown sugar, so it would taste like the Thames, hopefully in a good way, and not what I imagine the Thames actually tastes like, which I dread to think about. The kinds of periods we have, we've got a variety of things going on here. Top left is a Roman coin. If there are any Roman coin specialists, they might know better than I do about which specific period this is from. But it's got that lovely aged effect. Below that, we have a late 1600s Westerwald pottery sherd. And then center, we have a 17th century German salt glaze Westerwald pottery sherd. And on the right-hand side is almost William Morris, but not quite. It's a Victorian ruby lustreware tile, but very much a similar style and a similar period. Yeah, I just really enjoyed playing with these. I actually sent these to the people who'd found them on the Thames. I asked permission first if I could reproduce their finds and sent them in the post so they could have a nice side-by-side real version, biscuit version, and then eat the things that they had found on the Thames foreshore, which hopefully they got them the right way around. This set came from a visit I had to the British Museum when I was just getting back out into society again. It was one of my first trips out, and I walked up to the medieval rooms upstairs. And sometimes an idea for a biscuit set just like strikes me out of anywhere, and I have to immediately go home and plan it and make it, and I can't rest until it's done. This was one of those sets. I spent the entire train journey back to Birmingham pulling images that I'd taken on my phone, gathering them from the online catalogues, and deciding which examples best fit together. These are all different tile sets, but how could I capture something about the style in general by putting them together almost like a collage? So we've got a little bit of religious iconography, we've got some wet on wet technique with the cracks going through it. I'm particularly a fan of this one in the center. The flavor was honey, ginger, and cloves. I tried to experiment with some actual medieval flavors so that you could taste the medieval period as well as looking at objects from it. And I realized when I was making these ones that really what intrigues me most is craft. craft. It's like the human craft of making these things. The technique, the time that goes into creating different effects. And almost feels like an homage to that when I'm making them myself. It's spending that time as well, even though it's very much in a different medium. I don't think these would last quite as well as the originals still living on in the British Museum. And one more for this archaeology section. These were pieces of stained glass that were found in the attics, the Triforium at Westminster Abbey. Several years ago, those attics were cleared out to make space for a new gallery area, which you can go and visit now. And they found 30,000 thereabouts stained glass fragments of all different sizes and detail from different periods. And so this enormous project started to sort through them all, to clean them, to conserve them. Many are now, you can see them as part of the new windows that have been installed. They're beautiful. And there's something about stained glass that is possible to recreate, even though it's, you know, not a transparent substance, royal icing, with the right kind of effects and techniques. You can make it look believably like it's got light shining through it, which is quite fun. All right, the next section, we're going to design history. So away from archaeology, onto things like interior design, fashion history, etc. So this takes me back to my main interest, which is Elizabethan dress. All kinds of fabrics survive from that period, and all different techniques of fabric exist. These celebrate different collections, so I've been very choosy in choosing fabrics and styles from different places. On the far left-hand side, Jenny Tiramani, who I mentioned earlier, who designed that production of Twelfth Night, now runs the School of Historical Dress, where they teach those techniques. And also they have their own collections of fabrics, so you can go and visit exhibitions there. And this fabric, it's called a stamped velvet. So you take velvet, use a hot decorative stamp, and you stamp it onto the surface. It leaves a design behind. And relatively, that's a cheap way to add decoration to fabrics as opposed to having it woven. But this was the fabric that inspired that dress that Mark Rylance was wearing as Olivia. So they have that fragment that inspired the new fabric. And so you might recognize the design from earlier on. We've also got blackwork embroidery here, a favorite of mine. It crops up in all kinds of places in Elizabethan portraits. It's a way of decorating linen, so you might find it on undershirts, decorative cuffs, etc. In the center, I will show you the inspiration for this one. This was quite a special biscuit inspired by a portrait at the National Portrait Gallery. And we've got some velvet here and some lace from the Victorian Albert Museum. But this is that portrait. You're here in the room, you can have a very similar experience of getting up close and personal with a portrait from this period and appreciating the incredible detail that they capture of fabrics and decorative details. There's a portrait just over here of Queen Mary, which I was just admiring before the talk began. And the closer you get to it, you realize that these artists captured incredible details. This is a kind of embroidery that's with gold threads onto a black base. It's got pearls added to the top of it. It's extremely extravagant. Every inch of that outer fabric has been embroidered in that way. I wish I could do it justice in royal icing, but I very much enjoyed trying. And again, I just love creating gold details on biscuits. I think they look wonderful. Similar levels of detail are added to these interior design features from the same period. I wondered what Shakespeare's house might have looked like. A friend of mine was doing some research into that very question, and I really wanted to find out more about that because we think we know quite a lot about who Shakespeare was, but actually in terms of his social status, what he would have had access to, how much the materials would have cost, what kind of choices he might have made. So this is my friend Alex Hewitt. His research is fantastic. And she gathered all these sources of what a middling status person like Shakespeare might have used to decorate his home. So different wall painting techniques, wood carving techniques, plasterwork, textiles. So she helped me by sharing all these sources with me. And I thought by bringing them all together, I could get a sense of what that kind of visual world might look and feel like. So here is one close up next to its inspiration. This is a wall painting at Charterhouse Priory in Coventry, which still exists. We visited together on a day where it was open, you know, those special days of the year where they open it to the public. It was one of those days that felt like seeing behind closed doors that aren't usually publicly accessible. But I just love the way that it's been worn away over time, and you can still see this text, as well as the scratch marks that have formed from centuries of being there on the wall. This is a little wood-carved panel at Baddesley Clinton in Warwickshire, very close to where I live. I go there quite often. This was a lovely sort of symmetrical design to add in that wooden component in terms of texture. And this is the plasterwork ceiling at the Feathers Hotel in Ludlow. So you can actually still go and stay at a hotel with this Elizabethan plasterwork, which is wonderful. You often see Victorian versions of this style of plasterwork, especially at National Trust properties. I love it. And this is a great example of how densely populated it can be in terms of pattern. I actually simplified it a little bit to give it a bit more space. These are Delftware tiles. Is anybody a fan of Delftware in the room? They're quite popular. I would love to decorate my house with them if I could. These were all from the Victoria and Albert Museum collections. They have hundreds and hundreds of tiles. So many survive. These are across the 18th century. And essentially with this set, I was interested in all the different patterns that could come together to form one kind of dream fragment of wall that captures all those different, the simple tiles, the really complex tiles with figures, with places, with flower displays almost. And again, it gave me a chance to make them look cracked and really old, like they were real tiles, because that really adds to their story, I think. And to take into account that this style of pottery came from the Netherlands, I flavored them with specular spices. So cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, ginger, cardamom. The kitchen smelled amazing. And I have actually not eaten this set. Most of them get eaten. They either get sent in the post to somebody, or my husband dunks them in his cup of tea. Apparently they dunk very well in tea, but for some reason this set I still have at home. They keep very well. They don't actually go off particularly. There's nothing in biscuits or cookies that would deteriorate. And royal icing is one of the best preserved kinds of food there is, I think. You know, you hear about slices of wedding cake from Queen Victoria's wedding that still exist. And royal icing just seems to last forever. So they still look exactly now as they did then. I sometimes bring them out to show as real life examples of what these biscuits look like. They're about this big, if you're wondering. That tends to be my preferred size. So while this set was that very selective capturing of all different tiles that I just wanted to use my own stylistic preferences to bring together, this set was a different kind of challenge. This set was inspired by a place called David Parr House in Cambridge in the UK. Some nods of recognition there. This is a really special house that's not been publicly accessible for a very, very long time. David Parr was a craftsman in the Victorian period. He was a middle-class working man, and he was the person who would go and paint the William Morris designs into the houses of rich people. So he had this skill, he had the craft, but he was very much the sort of workman that we don't often hear about. And over a 40-year period, he had this very modest terraced house in Cambridge. And he painted every inch of this house with beautiful designs. And it's the most wonderful place. So each biscuit tries to bring together something in a room, the different patterns that work alongside each other. So this is the drawing room. These are all hand painted. These are not wallpapers, which is wild. Underneath, this is a dado rail. And so he's painted every single layer of that with a different design by hand. These are called pottery, these little gold details added to that design. So we have some biscuit pottery here as well. And the text that you can just see going around the edge, also hand painted. It's a Victorian homily. So the longer version that you can see on the biscuit reads, "Every pulse beats life away. Thus our every heaving breath wafts us to certain death. Seize the moments as they fly, know to live and learn to die. He who knows nothing, doubts nothing." These messages were like painted through the house. Imagine growing up there and living there. It's a wonderful family home. This is from the kitchen. This is a stained glass window in the kitchen alongside a kind of painted design that's on the lower half of that biscuit elsewhere in the room. So yeah, a different kind of challenge to try and capture all these patterns because it's overwhelming. They're everywhere. They're on the ceilings, they're on the walls, they're everywhere. And by trying to distill that into just 4 biscuits that would somehow capture the house as a whole, that was a really fun challenge. I enjoyed that one a lot, but I think they could have been some of the more time-consuming ones that I've made over the years because they're so complex and detailed and layered in their design. Back to our stained glass, but this time a bit more Art Deco. We're Tiffany Studios lamps here. A range of designs. There's a whole rainbow of different Tiffany designs. I couldn't choose which ones to recreate, so I thought, well, I'll make a whole rainbow of them and I'll have them just go along horizontally. And the challenge here was to try and get the colors along with the shapes that made up the design, but also the lower edge of those lamps are almost always as complex as the designs themselves. They don't have flat edges usually. And so finding a way to include that, again, they don't make cookie cutters that come out in these shapes. So it was all about finding it myself, using my high-tech paper rectangle technique to find a good segment and cutting it out by hand. As a side-by-side comparison to show you how lamp can become biscuit, this is the dragonfly design, which is just glorious in the sort of blues and yellow colors. And just by using a watercolor technique, this is, rather than using, say, a wet on wet technique that I showed you earlier, this is a plain white biscuit that using food coloring gels and vodka as my thinning agent, I then paint onto the surface to create that effect of glass, to make it look 3-dimensional and that it's got that depth to it. And to also give it a bit of personality. This lamp has real personality with those dragonflies. Okay, on to literary history. I keep coming back to books, old books, because they are so beautiful and there are so many layers to them of the lives that they've led since they were published. And also I found, as I'm sure you've also appreciated, each period of history has its own style of book design, in terms of its how it looks, how it feels. So first of all, illuminated manuscripts was something, that was one where I was just walking across my landing in my house one day and just thought, illuminated manuscripts, they must be biscuits. They would work perfectly as biscuits. I must now drop out all of my weekend plans and find some great examples and figure out how to make this a set that will capture medieval manuscripts. And they're just so fun, aren't they? They've got so many different characters to them. Every page of a medieval manuscript, it seems, has something weird and wonderful. So finding my favorites of those was a very enjoyable task. And these were also incredibly slow to make because of the calligraphy aspect to it, as well as the illustration. And it did give me a chance, I suppose, the positive of this, it gave me a chance to really look at the details. You can see that this little bat here is just a relatively small detail on a page. The other side could be that I've taken it out of context and you don't see it in the context of the whole page. There's pros and cons to this approach. Somebody actually had a tattoo made of this bat. They sent me a picture of it, which is a wonderful idea. But in terms of impact and academic research and creating art, that must be one of the more unusual examples. This is a very special detail. It actually crops up quite a lot in medieval manuscripts, I learned. This is a knight fighting a snail. We don't fully know the symbolic significance of what it means to have a knight fighting a snail. There are many theories about what it could mean, some of them agricultural, some of them more about international policy. I encourage you to look into the knight versus snail motif. It's very enjoyable to look at. And I particularly like this example of it. He looks like he's flying through the air that night. And I don't know it's going to work out well for that snail in the end. So in terms of those stylistic differences between periods of book history, we go from the medieval period to my own period of primary interest, which is the early modern period. This set felt more like an obligation at first. I felt like I'd spent so much time looking at all these periods which were not my own specialism. I felt I should probably do some academic books, early modern books of things that I actually work with and teach and use in my research. So these were a collection of different texts from the Shakespeare Birthplace Trust, the Folger Shakespeare Library. Many of them are plays, some of them are actual Shakespeare, some of them are Shakespeare sources, some of them are people writing back to Shakespeare after they've been published, and Milton is in here too. But as a side-by-side to show you where those details come from, this is the title page to Beaumont and Fletcher's The Maid's Tragedy. I adore the woodcut style of illustration that you often find in these texts. This is a duel that's happening at the end of the play between Aspasia, who is in disguise, and who actually allows herself to be killed and sort of dies by choice in this context. It's a really complex moment, captured in this woodcut, taken out of context, so it really makes you want to read the play and find out what on earth is happening here. This is an embroidered Bible. Somebody spent, I don't know how many weeks, crafting this incredible cover of a book. It's all stitched by hand with symbolic motifs of different plants. This is a fun one. These are annotations that were added by this sort of infamous academic from the early modern period, who's infamous because he absolutely scrawled by hand on every page of all the books that he owned, adding his own annotations to them. This is an Italian book of common sayings, sort of common sense sayings, and he just writes all along the edge. And then here he references Richard III and Hamlet. So he's like, oh yes, this is like Hamlet, this one. This reminds me of Shakespeare's plays. So that sort of afterlife of books interested me too, the different hands that you find in the margins of these texts. Now I promised when I put up a description of this talk, that we can learn something about a first folio, the binding of Shakespeare's first folio, by recreating it in royal icing. And that's true. I learned something very interesting about the first folio when I tried to recreate it here. This is from the Folger Shakespeare Library in Washington, DC. It has 82 copies of the first folio just within the library, which seems like a lot. It seems almost greedy, I will say. We don't have as many of that here in the UK. So this is number 16, the first folio number 16 of the Folger's 82. It's often called the Thomas Hanmer copy because an early Shakespeare editor called Sir Thomas Hanmer owned it. And I was trying to copy this squiggle from the top rectangle, and I thought, what on earth is this? There's this really odd stamp, and I can't figure out what on earth it's meant to be, so did some digging. And what's happened here is this man has acquired this copy of the folio, either bound or unbound. It turned out you could buy the first folio unbound, this first printing of Shakespeare's plays from 1623. And then he married into the Bunbury family. I had to do this whole family tree to figure out what was happening here. And when he passed it to his nephew had it bound with the family crest. This is the Bunbury family crest, which adorns this copy of the first folio. So the bindings of these books are unique to people who own them sometimes. It might be that you find a copy with its original binding. It's more likely that you find a copy that's been bound, say, in the 19th century or more recently if it looks quite modern. This one has its own family history to it, which I found really fun. These are examples of the same crest from different books. Our version here really goes for it with the whiskers. There's not a lot of detail in the face, but you can make out those whiskers, which are, yeah, fun. And this is a set, a very small set that I've not published yet. So this is not gone onto my website. I was recently lucky to visit Utah State University's special collections. So I flew across the Atlantic and I was looking through their collections. And this is a moving diagram in a book from about 1550. It's a diagram that communicates a very complex thing. It's meant to be educational, so you can understand this difficult concept out in the world. And what it is at the time, it was believed that the hours in the day became different lengths depending on the time of year. So the day was divided into, say, 24 segments, or 12 hours of daylight, for example. And in summer, those hours became longer, and in winter, the hours became shorter. It wasn't that the sun set earlier, it was that time was sort of elastic. And so you could use this diagram to stand outside and move depending on where the sort of stars were, and you can figure out how long the hours in the day were at that time of year, which is wild. And so I thought, let's make a Biscuit version. So this is, you could potentially stay, if you understood how this diagram worked. We don't really fully understand how it works now. We have this general understanding of what it probably did. These are tiny figures holding instruments. They're holding up those instruments, trying to understand the stars, the heavens. And there's a proverb written across here. My Latin is not great. It translates to, no day to pass without practicing the art. Oh no, no day without a line. No day without a line, which means basically no day to pass without practicing your art. So if that's art, like drawing something, so no day to pass without a line. And so you can rotate it, which was a new avenue of inquiry for me. I'd not done movable biscuits before, but that was quite fun. And I would love to be able to use it to understand the heavens, but I'll keep working on that. I couldn't resist bringing one last William Morris example in to this book history section. This William Morris founded the Kelmscott Press, where he decided to create new editions of old texts that were, first and foremost, thoroughly beautiful. And I adored this pattern, especially because it's so monochrome versus the patterns we looked at earlier. Same kind of feel to it, but monochrome. So this was a version of Reynard the Fox, who actually cropped up in the medieval manuscript set as well. There was an image of Reynard the Fox there. And finally, to finish, a fun section on film and TV, which relates back to my interest in costume design and reproducing historical styles to suit the aesthetic needs of a specific production. I adore the 2020 film adaptation of Emma. It's one of my favorite films. I've watched it a couple of times and realized that there is something that defines that film, and I really think it's its aesthetic. It's that it has this really specific color scheme, and it's so intentional in how it draws on its historical references and includes them. So for example, it includes 2 celebrity garments from the past, really famous garments that survive. It's recreated. This is a pink silk spencer from about 1815. A spencer jacket is that style that finishes very high on the waist. This one is held at Chertsey Museum, very directly recreated there. And I just love the idea of it being like original garment, film version of garment, biscuit. Like I could join that process of development and have my own biscuit that was inspired by that. And for a time, I worked at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and I would walk past this dress every time I entered. It's if you come through the lower passageway from the tube and you go past it, it used to be on display there. This is an evening dress from 1810, and they reproduced it almost exactly for the film. And they had this fabulous photo shoot, which was in Vogue, I think, or something like that. It's like high fashion, but also 18th, 19th century. And I enjoyed making my own version of that too. Much earlier than that, I tried to do a similar thing for the TV show Outlander, which is inspired by a similar period of fashion history, slightly earlier. And these are just fun as a way of looking at how costumes are defined by the combination of color and pattern, and how I could perhaps try and recreate that as much as I could in a rectangular form, including tartan, which was a bit of a challenge that I countered with an airbrush. Game of Thrones has a very special place in my heart for its costume design. There's something about creating fantasy worlds which draw to some extent on real fashion, but create something entirely new that feels alien and yet recognizable, that fascinates me, and it's a skill set that I envy in terms of designers. I started this set because I was rewatching series 1, and I wanted to see if I could create mother of pearl with biscuits. So that was where it started. I was like, can I recreate this chair to look actually like it has mother of pearl insets? And the rest of the set grew from there. So there are some costume details in here. Coming over to this biscuit. This was from armor, so I used that scratch effect that you saw on the ancient Greek shards earlier to create this almost Celtic design that had dragons and horses included in it. And another example of wall painting, but slightly less early modern, slightly more fantastical. And to show you one final set to finish, to come full circle, I published a book 2 years ago, which was the culmination of my PhD research. It's my PhD in a book, which was another difficult process. And I thought, how better to mark that moment than by making a biscuit set inspired by all the research that had gone into that book. And here it is. So the first biscuit set I showed you was from the PhD process of trying to figure out what I was looking at, and this is almost the end of that process. This is from Olivia's dress in Twelfth Night. These were just all different costumes that I'd spent time with over the last 4 years or so, tiny slivers of them, recreated. This is a gold version of black work. There's a portrait of Shakespeare here, the first folio portrait, which is very famous. Also old documents where we can find lists of what early modern playing companies had in their collections in terms of costumes and props. And so finding a way to make the book be biscuits felt like a good way to end this lecture. But yeah, so that's an adventure through many different biscuit sets that I've made over the years. You can probably tell that I've learned a little bit about lots of different things through doing that, but it's a process that I find really rewarding. And I really appreciate you coming to listen. So thank you so much. I will take any questions.
Thank you so much, Ella. Ella has kindly agreed to take some questions. If for the online audience, if you wouldn't mind putting them in the chat and somebody here will read them out. And anybody in the room, do just put your hand up and Annabelle will rush over with the microphone. Nigel.
Thank you. I think I've sat through roughly 400 lectures in this room, and I think this is the most amazing and fascinating one of those 400, and I really do think that. You obviously, some of these biscuits are more complicated than others and will take longer, but let's look at the Tudor costume one with the gold and the black and the pearls. Roughly how long would it take you to make that? And is that perfect one your first go, or do you have to have several goes at some of them?
Thank you so much. That's very kind. They vary quite a lot in length. That particular example, I think, was about 2 hours. I think about 2 hours. It could have been a little bit more, because that one in particular has a build-up of multiple lines, of individual lines to create a texture. That's a rare example because I had to wait for each line to dry before I added the next one. So it was a very complex process of roving around the biscuit to make sure I wouldn't lose the effect I was trying to create. If it's something that's more straightforward painting, it can be 1 hour. 1 hour is the minimum. It can go 3 or 4 hours. I find it a very meditative process. I really enjoy spending a weekend. I'll bake them on a Friday night. I'll spend the whole weekend with headphones on, listening to podcasts or music. And I find it very relaxing as a way of turning off from other things in my life. Thank you.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. How long do the biscuits last? And also, did you still have some of those from 2019? And also, do you ever exhibit them, the physical biscuit as opposed to, the digital representation? Because I'm sure there's a huge difference between being able to see, the actual piece versus online.
Yes, thank you. Some of them I have kept. I have maybe 2 boxes that I've kept. So I have the Delftware set, and I also have some that are based on 18th century trade cards that I couldn't quite bear to part with. Although I will say that that's partly because they took so long to paint. They were extremely intricate with calligraphy and also kind of line design, that by the time I'd finished painting them, they'd been out in the air for so many days that I kind of thought, I can't really give them to anyone at this point. These have probably gone stale. So I've kept them as examples in real life. A few of them have gone on display in real life. I made a set for Milton's cottage, which are based, they have like a portrait of Milton in the center, who's an early modern poet, parts of the house. And I was very, very delighted that those biscuits could be in the house on display for a period of time. They do last indefinitely as objects. I have some on my shelves that are maybe 3 or 4 years old now. I wouldn't eat them, but I don't have any concerns about them exploding or causing a biohazard or anything like that. So they last for an extremely long time, but not necessarily for eating.
Hi, thank you so much. You mentioned at some point the kind of public engagement facet of this work that you do. I mean, sort of humorously with the friend or person who got the bat tattoo based off the biscuit, based off the medieval manuscript. And that sort of sense of knowledge exchange. And obviously you've partnered with heritage organizations like Milton's Cottage. So I'm wondering, you know, what has been the benefit to your career as a scholar with that, or kind of, yeah, if you could just talk more about that public engagement side of it.
Sure, yeah. I think that's what I've found completely by accident is the outcome of the time spent on these biscuit sets. They're often eaten by maybe 1 or 2 people, but the way in which they are most valuable is as a way of opening up museum collections. And I didn't realize that that would be the case. I thought I was just being a massive nerd at home making biscuits inspired by old things. But it turns out that they can be quite a powerful tool, especially on social media, for bringing together disparate collections, or for celebrating something that might otherwise not go noticed. And so for me, I value greatly the time spent with the objects and the patterns. I learn a lot through the process of spending that time looking. Just as another example, I did one based on, it was a title page, The Tempest, in the first folio. And as I was painting the sort of header decorative detail, I was like, what is in this? This is bizarrely sort of exoticized imagery. There's this sort of figure in here, and I'm not really sure where this has come from. Was it specially designed? And I've since asked multiple Shakespeare editors, like, what is going on with the Tempest header in the first folio? And no one's looked at it. No one's noticed. So just the act of looking closely is something that doesn't always come as part of the academic analysis, especially when it's illustrations surrounding the text. So for me, that's the value. In terms of my career, it means I get to do fun things like this, which I feel so privileged to get to do. You know, I didn't start this as a very serious scholarly endeavor, but it has become a real arm of my week by week work, I suppose, which I feel extremely lucky about and very grateful for.
We've had lots of questions online around future projects and commissions. I'll read out one of them directly because it's just really lovely, phrased in a really lovely way. Is, can you reassure us that you plan to continue exploring these wonderful textures and designs in biscuits? I should hate to find there would be no more.
I have a couple more that I've finished that are not yet published. You saw one of them. It's called a volval, that rotating diagram. The other is based on Victorian scrapbooks, which I'm looking forward to sharing. It felt quite festive. I didn't start out to make a festive biscuit set. I made it a few months ago, but that will come out in the run up to Christmas. I will make more. I will be going on maternity leave at Christmas. And I imagine that with a small baby in the house, I might have not so many hands free to spend this time. But I very much will continue. And yeah, thank you.
I noticed such a variety of techniques in the decoration. I wonder if you've studied painting, and if so, oil, watercolor, wash, what relates to royal icing?
I did an art A-level, which is the extent of my professional training in art. My dad was an artist. He was also a teacher, so for him as well, I have his paintings of him. He passed away 10 years ago. So he never experienced the biscuits, and it would have been something I shared with him. But yes, I have had I've been raised to very much lean into this creative side and given opportunities to do that. It's not something that I've trained extensively in. But yeah, I don't know why I don't generally do like watercolor versions of things. I don't know why it's biscuit specifically. I think it's just feels fun. Like it feels special to make something ephemeral. It feels different to make something that's just going to be eaten at the end of it. I started doing it because I could send them to people in the post as birthday presents at a time when I couldn't visit. You know, we were in lockdown. I wanted to make a birthday present for my grandparents, and these could go in the post. I could get them, you know, to them. And so the giving of them and them being something that could be eaten was part of it, really. And I love the flavor aspect too.
We'll take one more question in the hall, please, Annabelle.
Hi, I really love the way that you have indeed opened up details of well-known collections and also interiors of buildings that not many people get to see. The Charter House in Coventry, I highly recommend anyone if you get a chance to visit it. It's a real gem of a medieval priory that's recently been redeveloped thanks to a National Lottery Heritage Grant. I was actually a property guardian there while they were developing the grant, and that was an interesting time to live there. But there are so many things that I'd love to say and respond to, but the thing that I'd like to ask you is, you say that your biscuits depicting Sacrobosco's diagrams are unpublished. I work at the Royal Astronomical Society. I'd really like to share with that community the groundbreaking news that a Volvel had been made in biscuit form. Is this still embargoed, or should we wait until it's published?
It's because I did it in collaboration with Utah State University. I haven't published it yet because we just need to check the wording that's going to go alongside it. So it will very soon, within the next couple of weeks, it will be available. But you're welcome to send it in a WhatsApp group.
Okay, well, before we end up by thanking Ella, I would just like to announce that our next lecture here at the Society is this on Thursday, the 24th of October, this Thursday, at 5 o'clock, and it's entitled Caesar, Boulogne, Portus Itius and Thanet, All Sorted Now? By Mark Samuel, FSA. So I hope to see many of you there on Thursday evening. So this just leaves us to thank Ella. I think you'll all appreciate that she is clearly an artist to her very fingertips. Anybody who stops dead on a landing and says, illuminated manuscripts, they must be made into biscuits, is clearly somebody who has art running right through her. It's interesting, I suppose, from the point of view of the Society, in how Ella's historic interest and academic knowledge couples with her artistic response and actually enables her to look closely at the objects, but also through her eyes, it enables us to look at the objects and the textiles in a very, very different way. And finally, it's probably too dark for you to notice, but at one stage I glanced around at the audience and everybody in the room was beaming. So just thank you very much for sharing a bit of your joy with all of us here today. Thank you. Sit down.